So with that, I'm going to leave it to Steve. So welcome again, Steve, and take it away.
Thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. As Gustavo said, I'm visiting from Boston, and I'd like to share a little bit about some issues around energy consumption and plug-in vehicles. First, some results from the BMW Active E trial, which was a fleet of electric vehicles launched by BMW a couple of years ago. Second, we'll be reviewing some results from the Toyota Prius plug-in hybrid fleet, which was also launched a few years ago. The next topic will be on charging behavior, so how people actually choose to charge or not to charge their vehicles, and that's drawing from the Toyota data. And then finally, I'd like to, if we have time, say a few words about plug-ins within the rental context, specifically using some results from a survey of car-sharing users. So the slide I put up here, this is going to be more of a rhetorical question since this is a webinar. But does anybody notice anything unusual about this picture? Just think about it for a few seconds. This is my personal vehicle, which is a plug-in hybrid vehicle. Can everybody hear me? I'm getting a message that there's an audio problem. Okay, I seem to hear people saying that they can hear me.
Thank you, Charlotte, for, yes, audio's back. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. Well, I guess now you've had plenty of time to look at this image. But I think what you should see here is that the average fuel consumption. So if you look at the middle of the screen, you can see that the average fuel consumption is 16.8 miles per gallon. So this is actually my personal plug-in hybrid vehicle. The photo was taken about a month ago, just before I went away for winter vacation. And for reference, that's about what I would be expecting to get out of a full-size pickup truck with a V8. So how is that? So let's look at a theoretic example. So the gray curve at the bottom of the screen represents drive energy, or it's the theoretical energy consumption of a car weighing about 1,900 kilograms, traveling at a steady speed shown on the x-axis. But if we envision a 1, 2, or a 5 kilowatt steady state accessory load, where we see the green, blue, and red graphs in the upper part of the figure, what you see is the picture changes quite a bit. So of particular interest is the relative portion of the energy devoted to accessory consumption. So at high speeds, the total energy consumption is dominated by the energy that we use to move the vehicle. So you can see that the marginal contribution of the accessory energy is very small at that speed. But at the lower speeds, essentially what we see more frequently in urban driving, even a 1 kilowatt parasitic load would represent nearly half the energy consumption per unit distance. And while the actual numbers vary widely, in our experiments, a 1 to 5 kilowatt accessory load can actually be very common in an electric vehicle. So for instance, a resistive heater is found in some electric vehicles, can easily be 6 or 7 kilowatts. And similarly, an air conditioning unit can also be a couple of kilowatts as well, a couple or 3 kilowatts as well. So let's look here at some actual data. So how does this play out in a real vehicle? So this figure comes from a test done by Ford. This is a slide provided by Ford on its Focus electric vehicle. But I've seen similar data, very similar graphs for both the Nissan Leaf and the Chevrolet Volt in electric drive mode. What you can see is that the climate control can cut the range in half under very cold conditions. And so that explains to a certain extent the high energy consumption in my vehicle. When the drive cycles are very, very short in cold weather, the car only sees aggressive transient loads, and it has to use essentially full power to bring up the vehicle up to temperature or down to temperature if it's a very high temperature. And by the time the car is comfortable, it's actually reached its destination. So while the number you see here could be that the range is actually cut by 50% in a steady state condition, it could actually be that in a sequence of short trips, the actual energy consumption could end up being more than twice as high. So let's look at, for a minute at a block diagram representing the energy flow in an electric vehicle. So here the green blocks that represent areas of energy storage, so the battery energy, the kinetic energy, or the potential energy of the vehicle. And on the left-hand side, that's the battery, and in the middle is the potential and kinetic energy of the vehicle itself. So the red blocks represent areas of energy loss. So these are losses in the battery system itself, energy losses in the drivetrain, the friction brakes, or aerodynamic drag in the middle of 3 red blocks, and auxiliary energy in the bottom red block. So finally, the purple blocks represent the controls the driver can adjust. So on the top left, the driver can control how aggressively the car accelerates or brakes or steers. And on the bottom left are other factors such as cargo loading, maintenance, and climate control settings, which are also under the control of the driver. So how does this actually play out in real-world scenarios? So to talk about this, I was fortunate to have access to data from a fleet of electric vehicles. So this is data from the BMW Active E trial. And the Active E is a battery electric vehicle. It was leased to customers starting in 2012. And it used a battery and propulsion system similar to the components of the i3 that's on the market today. So the following results are based on 600 vehicles for which we studied the energy consumption for about 1 calendar year from mid-2012 to mid-2013. And this analysis includes approximately 60,000 drive charge events for the fleet after removing erroneous and shorter drive cycles. So a large number of data fields were gathered directly from the vehicle telematics system. The data was gathered and it was aggregated on a per charge level. So subsequent trips without charging are treated as a single observation. And so for each drive charge event we observed the distance traveled, the energy consumption and average speeds, as well as a number of other metrics dealing with the battery health, the battery status. So in addition to the total energy consumption of the vehicle, we were able to separately measure energy consumption used for the propulsion of the vehicle, as well as for accessory heating, air conditioning, lighting, and infotainment. So essentially we had 2 observations for each data point, the accessory energy consumption and the drive energy consumption. So this plot shows the distribution of the accessory energy consumption as a function of the total energy consumption per drive charge event. So what you can see here, one of the takeaways is that there's a very large variation in the level of the energy that accessories consume as a fraction of the total energy. But on average, accessories consume nearly 25% of the total energy. And virtually all drive cycles, the number was at least 15%, and in some cases, it was more than half the energy, the total energy consumption. And remember that this was excluding very short drive cycles, where the numbers would be expected to be even higher. And so, heating and air conditioning systems are particularly large energy consumers. So it might be tempting to say, well, most of this variation in energy consumption is due just to differences in climate, and so you could make a fairly good estimate just based on looking at where the vehicle is located. But what we actually found is that there's quite a large variability even on the same vehicle. So this is presumably in the same location and driven by the same driver, or at least a member of the same household. So this plot shows the distribution in differences in energy consumption per unit distance between successive drive charge observations in the same vehicle. So the shaded green areas there show the number of observations, so there's the area under the curve, show the number of observations where the energy consumption per unit distance on one trip differed by more than 30% in either direction from the energy consumption in the previous trip in the exact same vehicle. So for example, if a vehicle had an energy consumption of 200 watt-hours per kilometer, in 15% of the cases on the following observation, you'd see an energy consumption below 140 watt-hours per kilometer or in excess of 260 watt-hours per kilometer, which is quite a large difference for the same vehicle in the same location. So this is the same chart showing the change in energy consumption between the successive drive charge events. But in this time, the consumption is broken out by the drive energy, so again, the energy used to move the vehicle, and the auxiliary energy used for accessories. And what this chart shows us is that the auxiliary energy consumption has substantially higher variability between successive trips. So in this case, the energy consumption differed by more than 30% in nearly half the cases. So why is this micro-level heterogeneity a problem? So for one thing, it makes predicting range very difficult. So you'll see the quote here that a more accurate distance to empty estimate may be more valuable to an EV buyer than increasing the size of the battery pack. But if we see this high variability from trip to trip, it makes predicting range extremely difficult. So while range prediction algorithms remain confidential at most companies, in large part they're based on blends of long and short-term moving averages. And so because of this, our ability to make accurate predictions of the future energy consumption and range is highly dependent on whether or not the past energy consumption is representative of the future. And we've seen in this data that's very often problematic. So up to this point, we've been talking about the Active E, which was an electric vehicle. So what happens when we're talking about a plug-in hybrid, not just an electric vehicle? So we have all the same factors that affect the electric vehicles that make analyzing energy consumption difficult. So we have driver aggressiveness, the ambient conditions in the traffic, and the accessory usage. But now there are more problems. So we have two fuels that we have to deal with. So we want to evaluate energy consumption for two fuels. And then we also, now how the user refuels or recharges the vehicle can affect the split between those two fuel types. So I'd like to talk today about the results from a Prius plug-in hybrid study that we published last year. So we followed 125 vehicles for one calendar year, and there are about approximately 60,000 drive observations, so on the same order of magnitude as the study that with the BMW vehicles. And in this case, we were able to observe individual drive events, not just a collection of drives within a single charge. So the PHEVs in this trial operate in three modes. So they can operate in all-electric mode, or blended mode, or charge-sustaining modes. The blended mode, essentially what that means is it's a charge-depleting mode, but it's consuming both gasoline and electricity to move the vehicle. And so the selection of the vehicle, so this could be very high HVAC settings, it could be an aggressive acceleration, or just a high speed that would cause the vehicle to operate, to start the ICE and operate in a blended mode or a charge-sustaining mode. So the vehicle had about a 3 kilowatt hour working capacity for the battery, which translated into approximately a 13-mile charge depleting range. So let's talk a little bit about energy consumption. So again, what we see here, similarly to what we saw with the data from BMW, we see a very large distribution in the energy consumption used to move the vehicle. So the average was just over 200 watt-hours per kilometer. So basically getting 3 miles out of a kilowatt hour of energy, which is around the numbers that we typically see. But the spread was quite high. So from the best case to worst case cases, we saw differences in energy consumption by a factor of 4. So let's talk a little bit about gasoline consumption. So in charge-sustaining mode, or the conventional hybrid mode, where the vehicle is not actively drawing down the level of charge of the battery, the vehicle is consumed between 4 and 6 liters per 100 kilometers. And in charge-depleting mode, the gasoline consumption was approximately halved, and so that was to an average of approximately 2.5 liters per 100 kilometers. And in this mode, the vehicle, as I said, is drawing energy from both the battery and the gasoline tank at the same time. So some portions of the drive, gasoline consumption may be 0. So let's talk, since gasoline is being burned in this charge-depleting mode, just looking at the portion of miles that's traveled in charge-depleting mode is a relatively poor measure of how much we've actually saved. So that's something that you typically see as a utility factor. But if we're burning gasoline in that mode, that may not be the measure of interest. So we calculated a petroleum displacement factor, which was an estimate of the fraction of total miles that would have been powered by electricity alone. So we do this essentially by taking the number of miles that we operated in charge-depleting mode, and then we subtract the number of miles that we would have expected the vehicle to travel on the gasoline that it burned in that mode. And so in this case, what we see is that the number is about half. So what we expect in this trip is typically, in this set of observations, is typically about 14% of the miles traveled by those vehicles on average were powered by electricity. But again, we see enormous variation, and I think that's really a theme of this talk today. So out of 125 vehicles in the trial, 5 of them use electricity for under 1% of their miles. They were essentially never charged, and they were just operated as a conventional hybrid. And then of the 125 vehicles, 21 of them used electricity for fewer than 5% of the miles traveled. But on the other end of the scale, so out on the tail on the right, we see there are a handful of vehicles that covered about half their mileage on electricity alone, despite only having this very small 3 kilowatt-hour battery. So this was probably attributable to very short drive cycles and religious charging by the users of the vehicle. So the next part of this work was we wanted to understand how things might have been different if the vehicles had been designed slightly differently or if the people behaved slightly differently. So we conducted a what-if analysis and essentially simulated all 60,000 trips, one factor at a time. That's what the OFAT at the top of the slide stands for, is one factor at a time. We simulated all 60,000 trips with new charging schedules, so up from once a day all the way up to at every stop where the vehicle was parked for at least 30 minutes, down to simply at every stop. Also simulated the trips for new battery sizes up to 30 kilowatt hours, and also new charging rates. So these vehicles were equipped with 110 volt, sort of a level 1 charger, and virtually all of them at the time used exclusively that level 1 charger. And we recalculated the energy consumption, the electricity consumption, the gasoline consumption, and then the utility factor and petroleum displacement, as we've just seen. So what did we find out? So the biggest result from the what-if analysis was the impact that would have been realized from frequent level 1 charging. So if these vehicles had charged at all stops, even short ones, where the vehicle was parked only for a couple of minutes, we expect that they would have doubled the fraction of miles that were powered by electricity. And in order to achieve the same result exclusively through battery capacity, the vehicle would have needed 5 times the battery capacity, or about a 15 kilowatt hour usable pack. So essentially what we would have had to do is take those Prius plug-in hybrids and turn them into Chevrolet Volts. And so these vehicles charged almost exclusively on the included 110 volt chargers. And because the batteries had such a small capacity, most of the time when the vehicles were plugged in, they were plugged in long enough to charge fully. So in this case, fast charging these vehicles with the same battery size and the same plug-in behavior would have done almost nothing. We saw basically just a 1 or 2% improvement in the fraction of electrified miles. So the story could be completely different, of course, if we changed multiple factors at the same time. So if we incorporated, say, a larger battery and fast charging, we probably would have seen very different results. But it's also likely that the user of a vehicle like that would have changed their charging behavior as well. So it's difficult to start to predict out past 1 or 2 factors that would have changed. So I think that's a good segue for the topic of charging behavior. So in this case, essentially we had seen relatively little literature at the time, and there are a few papers since this has been published, but there's relatively little literature on observed charging behavior. And so we were largely looking at sort of static assumptions that people would charge every night at home or charge every time the vehicle was stopped more than a certain number of times. And simply that we wanted to essentially test how good those assumptions were in the literature. So we used a mixed logit model to assess the probability of both finding and using a charger. And the reason I'd say that finding and using is important, so this is essentially the joint probability of those two things, because since these were 110 volt chargers, it's very difficult to know the opportunities where someone actually had a 110 volt outlet available to them. So since we didn't have a very good information on that, we modeled the joint probability of finding and using a charger. So the effects were on location, on the condition of the battery, so the state of charge, the day of the week and the time of the day, and the time until next trip. And so I'm not going to go too deep into the modeling, but I'm just going to share the sort of the top level results here. So the factors increasing charging probability. So the first is if there's a longer time until the subsequent trip. So up to 3 hours, what we saw is that there is a relatively large significance of the idle time of that vehicle at that stop towards increasing charging probability. Also, if it was the last trip of the day, if that vehicle wasn't going to be taken out again that calendar day, then that also had a positive impact on the probability that someone would charge the vehicle. So we also found that ending at that home location indicated a higher probability of charging. And we put an asterisk on the home there because since we didn't actually know where the owners of these vehicles are, we defined home as the place that that vehicle had woken up that morning. So where did that vehicle start that day? That's home. And if the trip ends at that location, it's a large probability that the vehicle will be charged. A lower state of charge also increased the probability that someone will plug the vehicle in. So it's more likely if the battery is flat, they're going to plug in the vehicle. And also earlier in the day. The earlier in the day the vehicle was returned, the higher the probability that the vehicle would be charged. But I think that the important thing, again, the theme of this conversation is significant heterogeneity, so non-uniform behavior. So when we actually simulate the charging probability, you can see in these three panels here, we just calculated the probability that somebody would plug in by setting some of these variables to certain levels. So what you can see here, let's start at I suppose at the top left. So if the state of charge were 0, so a flat battery, 12 hours until the next trip, the length of the last trip was about 10 miles, and the last trip of the day, and it ends at a home location at 6 p.m., there's more than a 50-50 chance that that user, at least in this data set, that user would have plugged in the vehicle. But let's look at the bottom figure. So if the state of charge is 50%, there's going to be another trip in 1 hour, and it does not end at the home location. The probability of somebody plugging that vehicle is down to 4%. And no matter how hard we tried, so playing with these variables until you get the absolute best case scenario, there's still only about a 60% chance that somebody would actually plug in that vehicle at the end of the trip. So I think that what that really underlines here are a few things. So number one is there's just very high variability in energy consumption in plug-in vehicles, even trip to trip, from one trip to the next in the same vehicle. That accessories are a very large source of power draw and variability in that power draw. And then finally, in terms of charging, I think we need to get away, and I think we increasingly are getting away from the assumption of charging to 100% every night. And I think we really need to focus some more effort on what we understand, what we believe about how people charge these vehicles. I think an interesting point that I heard from a representative from Nissan a couple of days ago is that in their initial fleet of vehicles, so the very early Leafs that were sold, I think it was about 80%, 75 or 80% of the customers took a home charging unit when they purchased the vehicle, and that number now is down to under 50%. I think 45% is the number that he said, if I remember correctly. And so I think that what that highlights is that either A, there are lots of repeat customers, so they already have a charger. That's one possibility. But I think the other possibility is that there are lots of people that are not going to be charging at home every night. They're looking to public charging or workplace charging, which I think is pretty interesting. So I think I think we should break for questions at this point on the material I've presented, and then I have a couple of more slides that I'd like to present on plug-in behavior and preferences in the shared fleet. But if there are any questions, why don't we go ahead and take them on what we have now.
The conference has been unmuted.
Well, thank you, Steve. That was extremely interesting, and I think there are plenty of conclusions and lessons for policy and planning, of course. So can people actually speak on the phone now? So if somebody has a question and wants to just speak up as opposed to typing, maybe more comfortable and just go ahead and kind of more of a discussion kind of a setting as opposed to kind of a reading questions. Feel free to go ahead and ask questions to Steve.
Steve, I have a question. This is Brett from CSE.
Yes, go ahead.
Just speaking to your last point.
Brett, 1 second. So I'm going to ask people that we have unmuted you, but if you could if you're not speaking and you can keep your phone muted so we don't have much noise coming through, that would be ideal. I appreciate that.
An electric heater is going to, well, let's look at.
Okay, so the question is,
we're hearing people on the phone. If you can mute your phone, that would be ideal. Thank you.
Wires to town, back and forth if you need to.
I think somebody's unmuted. Could you please mute your phone if you're not asking a question?
And so the difference between that 120 miles and if you're using the electric heater all the time, which is a couple of small electric coil and
Maybe we should have them present a seminar.
Yeah.
Do you want to mute them?
Why don't go ahead and try, Brett, and see how it goes. Maybe it'll be temporary.
It's a quick one, and it just builds on the comment or your interpretation of the Nissan behavior. And the one possibility that seemed to be neglected in that was not that they're not charging at home, but that they're simply not feeling the need to invest in a level 2 charger, i.e. that they could just be plugging into the wall. And
Yeah,
I was wondering,
that's a very, very good point. I think so. I think that there are a number. First of all, I think yes. I think that very much is a possibility. I think that there is a paper, and I think it was also by Frank, so that the author of the study for which there's a quote a few slides back, where he talked about users' willingness to use the range of their vehicle more deeply the longer they own the vehicle. So people are sort of relatively skittish early on in the way they use the vehicle, but as time goes on, 6 months, 12 months into ownership, they're more and more comfortable dipping into that range. And so I think that what you're saying could very much be true. People may be comfortable in relying on that 110 volt charging as it'll meet their needs most of the time. I think that's a good point.
Actually putting on something that
Any follow-up to that, Brett?
similar to the reverse.
no, thanks, and I'll go on mute to contribute to the group.
Thank you for that. Other questions from the group?
Where there are people and pedestrians. So
I have
This is Liz from Maryland Department of the Environment. Where were these studies conducted? Were they done in California? Maybe I missed that, or up in the Northeast?
Yeah, I didn't want to get too much into the details in terms of these vehicles, but the short answer is that they're located all over the place.
Okay.
So in the case of the BMWs, there are a lot of them in California. There were some also in the Northeast, and I think also in the Pacific Northwest.
I mean, did your data show differences based on location? One of the things I'm wondering about is just the cost of electricity in certain locales, such as California, and whether people who have access to workplace charging might defer their home charging to, somebody else's nickel.
Well, yeah, I mean, I know I personally do that with my own plug-in vehicle, so I certainly I can't blame anybody else for doing it. But I think so it's possible. I think that's very much possible. So I think the important thing to remember about these, so I think what you're referring to more specifically is the Prius trial with the charging behavior, and so one challenge of that particular data set was that the vehicles weren't actually sort of leased out to private customers. So these were educational partners, these were corporate partners. Some of them did go out for periods of time to individual families. But the data that we had on the ownership of those vehicles during the trial was relatively poor. And so I think that had these been privately owned vehicles, I think I very much would have agreed with your assumption. I think given the way that these vehicles were used, I think it may have been a question of people not caring as much about charging regardless of the fact whether or not they were paying for fuel. So I think that in many of these cases, the vehicles weren't the drivers of the vehicles weren't paying for fuel, and they also weren't paying for electricity.
Okay.
So that may have contributed to the indifference there.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think that's an important question, Lisa. When you look at that heterogeneity, have you seen that mostly is that both at the individual level and the group level, or one or the other? In other words, is it the same person changing behavior depending on when and where they drive? Do you see that being maybe a function of the location where they are?
This is I think it's a question of both. So this is both heterogeneity, both in individual behavior. Although remember that we have data on the vehicle level. So unfortunately, one observation for vehicle N might have a different driver than 10 observations later for vehicle N. That's less true of the BMW data, but unfortunately we didn't observe the as many of the charging events as we had for the Toyota data.
Understand. Other questions?
This is Dave Reichmuth from the Union of Concerned Scientists.
Hi, Dave. Yes, I can hear you.
I just had some questions. I want to know if you had any either data or intuition on how the petroleum displacement factor might change over time, either with maybe a second owner, or which you probably don't have data on, or sort of length of time with the vehicle.
So I think the relationship of the petroleum displacement factor relative to sort of the more commonly used utility factor term is really a function of that blended mode, right? So if the vehicle basically flats the battery and never mixes gasoline and electricity consumption, then your petroleum displacement factor would be the same thing as your utility factor. So that's the way people had it, I think, initially envisioned that the volt would work. Essentially, it would just basically flat the battery and then start the engine. And for all intents and purposes, that's basically the way it does work. But for vehicles where you've got this sort of more ongoing blending of electricity and gasoline consumption, that's what's really going to determine how different the utility factor is from the petroleum displacement factor.
Sorry, I shouldn't have confused it then. I guess what I would be asking is how does the utility factor or the charging behavior change as people would either get more used to it or maybe even second owners?
So the charging behavior, unfortunately, we didn't really observe time trends, and I think even if we had, those would have been conflated with the change. I realized that when I was listening to them, but after you saw the variation, it would have been conflated with the different users of the vehicle. So I think that like any good academic will tell you, more study is needed, which is that I think that we need to engage in some sort of more long-term studies of specific users of the vehicle. And I would say a related issue is one that is the one of the selection of vehicles for specific trips, right? So not only does the person have the choice about whether to charge the vehicle or not, or how to drive the vehicle. In many cases, people that own EVs are in multiple vehicle households. So really the answer is that we need to understand how vehicle selection is playing into this as well. And so the ideal case would be to monitor not only the use of these EVs in future trials, but also the use of other vehicles in the same household.
What the shape of the coating should be on the phone. It's all a 3D.
Hi, this is Mark Winslow, Cali, PA, and I guess my question is whether you have any advice for policymakers. And I'll narrow it down a little bit, although we're happy to hear whatever you have. There's sort of a conversation that's sometimes characterized as a polar conversation, where one pole is the investing in the vehicles and always increasing battery size, and then the other pole is really using those dollars and investing in the infrastructure. Of course, it's always more complicated than that, but it sounds to me as if maybe a preliminary result is really sort of on the infrastructure side, that if we increase the charging opportunity, that increases EVMT more than maybe the same investment in a larger battery.
Yeah, so I think it's a very interesting question, and I certainly agree with you that there tends to be some polarized debates about pushing infrastructure or pushing vehicles or both. And I think that my single biggest piece of advice would come down to get these vehicles into the hands of the people that will use them efficiently. And that sounds easy, but of course it's not. So I think that most of if we look at the policy incentives, the policy levers that we've been using for plug-in vehicles, they've largely been sort of spreading peanut butter around. It's basically the same incentives are available for everybody. It's like spreading money around for paving, right? It's easy to do because it's very evenly spread. But I think the fact is that people in very cold climates, very short drives, aren't going to be able to use these vehicles very efficiently. And then if we layer on top of that the issue about the issue of the generation mix, and there's a whole separate body of literature that I didn't really talk about today that addresses how clean the grid mixes are. But I will point you in the direction, I think, of two papers. So there's Kara Kockelman's group at UT Austin has done some good work, and Jeremy Mihalik's group at CMU have done some good work looking at when and where vehicles are plugged in and exactly what the impact on the grid is at that point in time. And what they found is, the answer, of course, is that PEVs are frequently much cleaner than gasoline vehicles, but not always. And especially if you look at grid mixes that are more heavily coal, and if you start to take into account sulfur emissions, what you find out is that you may, on a monetized basis, you may be generating as much or more damage as you would from a gasoline vehicle. So all that's a roundabout way of saying, get these vehicles into the hands of people that can use them efficiently, where the grid is clean. And I think that we've got relatively little money, compared to the scale of the investment in vehicles, and so we need to make sure that we use it effectively.
Any comments on that?
So just a quick follow-on, Gustavo, if you don't mind. Mark is thinking the same way I was, and I was wondering if you could maybe even take that polarization thought a bit farther, and do you have any thoughts about incentivizing types of vehicles differently, plug-in hybrids versus battery electrics, or just within the vehicle space? Do you have any comments on effective incentivization that goes beyond sort of geographic
Sure.
sweet spots versus non-sweet spots?
I think that, again, I'll point back to the literature and say that there was a study that came out of Idaho National Labs, I believe, and I think it was their data that showed that Volts were traveling as many or more EV miles as Leafs. Was that the INL study, Gustavo?
Yeah.
I think so.
It's not like a real paper, but
it was just
data that's been shown.
Yeah, so it's just one of those infographics, and I think that people have put forth lots of reasons why that might be the case, but I think that sort of the most appealing answer to me, at least, is that just people are more comfortable using that vehicle for more of their travel, right? So I think that this I think if you ask me to sort of nail down an answer, I mean, I voted with my own personal dollars in terms of a plug-in hybrid, and I think that and of course that's the vehicle that I use for 99.9% of my travel, and I think that that's reflective, sort of more often of many buyers. If you buy a plug-in hybrid vehicle, then that is usable for a greater percentage of your travel needs, and I think that we at least ought to take that into consideration in terms of policy, not just look at the ultimate capabilities of the battery on board that vehicle or the pack size, but also consider how people might be shifting trips amongst vehicles in a household.
I mean, I think that's an important question that probably goes beyond this presentation today. But being this early in the market, I think it's important to think about the importance of EVMT, but also the importance of having cars on the road. So whether it's PHEVs or EVs, that's depending on how you look at the question, it may be one or the other perhaps. But it's important to have whether the drivers are efficient or not. It's still important to have the EVs or the PHEVs on the road because that helps the market move forward. But if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to the question of uncertainties and heterogeneity. If you don't mind going back to your slides,
sure.
To those histograms. And I know you can't say too much on the location specifics, maybe because of your data sources. But looking at that kind of graph makes me think very much. What does that really mean? If it's for the same person, and if that's the case, you can perhaps induce different behaviors in different ways, or whether the guys on the left of that curve represent, let's say, one state versus other states in the center versus other states on the right. depending on perhaps the use of heating and that kind of question. So is there something that you can say today about what is really causing some of that distribution that you see there?
Well, of course, I guess we have to come back to this diagram of the vehicle, and there are a lot of factors at play. I think that so the distributions of the energy consumption, the one I have up on the screen right now, for instance, that's of all trips. So that is representing the heterogeneity both within vehicles and across vehicles. So unfortunately, this graph alone doesn't tell you a whole lot. We did see, unfortunately, I don't have graphs to support this here, but we did see significant heterogeneity even amongst vehicles in similar locations. You do see some changes with regard to climate. So vehicles that are driven in the winter do suffer from higher energy consumption as a rule. That's not just a function of the accessories. It's also a function of the sort of the more fundamentals of the vehicle, the rolling resistance and so on. I think that there are, at the end of the day, a lot of sources of energy, and I guess I would point back to this graph, looking, and I'll index back to it here in a second. I would point back, I think, to this graph, or even to this graph. It's the high variation, same person, same vehicle, same place, and there's still a lot of heterogeneity that's difficult to account for.
Interesting. So that's for the same person, basically.
Well, the same person or the same household, at least.
Can you explain that in any way, or?
So I have a theory. So I have a theory that this may be, the example may be somewhat cyclic, which is that you charge in the morning, you unplug the car, you get in and it's cold. Let's say it's winter, and you're going to turn on the heater full blast to get where you're going. And in the afternoon, temperature will have warmed up, and then so you use the heater less in the afternoon. It's more sun load, and so on. The vehicle maybe is parked in the sun. And then maybe another situation that could be driving this would be in a hot climate. So you use virtually no HVAC energy in the morning, but the day is much hotter, and you'd use a lot of HVAC energy in the afternoon. But remember that these weren't just subsequent trips. So that would have only applied to vehicles that were charged at every stop. We would have observed that driving some of this behavior. It could be a function of traffic. That's another thing. It could be basically people driving more aggressively in heavy traffic. But it's difficult to explain. Unfortunately, the data just gives us what it gives us, and we have to generate hypotheses. But those are I think are some reasons I would hypothesize.
Okay, thank you. Other questions for Steve?
I do have a couple more slides on the
car sharing.
On car sharing, if we could I can just go to those very quickly.
Let me just make sure there is no more questions before you move on to those. Any final questions on the charging section of the presentation?
I guess one might be if you could just speculate a little bit on what the plug-in Prius results might have been a function of that specific vehicle. In other words, is there a significant enough difference or a threshold effect? If the battery was bigger, would they have charged more or less? Can you compare the Active E to the plug-in Prius to sort of tease out any of those trends or thoughts in that regard?
Okay, sure. I guess the short answer is a lot of things changed between those two studies. So in the case of the Prius went out earlier. It was given just basically with 110-volt chargers, and the infrastructure. There's less infrastructure availability at the time when those vehicles were launched. So I think that what you're onto is that the behavior would be very different. The charging behavior would be very different if the vehicle were different. And of course, then you also have to deal with that the users of the vehicle would probably be different as well. So you have, whenever you talk about a study like this, you need to consider what we call selection bias, which is that the people who purchase these vehicles themselves have certain characteristics and certain attitudes that would lead them both to buy that vehicle and to behave in a certain way. So I think that's another thing that you need to be aware of. But I mean, the short answer is I think that if people purchase the capacity, I think that they generally want to use it as much as possible. So if they're going to be a person that's purchasing a lot of battery capacity, or even more, if they're going to be purchasing a vehicle that only has a battery, they're probably going to be trying to use that investment as much as they can.
Well, thank you, Steve. For lack of other questions, we can perhaps move to the car sharing.
Sure. So let me just quickly say why I wanted to include this piece. And I think car sharing, it's one of those things where it's only a small number of vehicles. So there are only about 25,000 vehicles for reference in the car sharing fleet. But it's the opportunity to study over 1 million consumers. I think the number these days is actually closer to 2 million. And these are people that use these vehicles for very short durations. And so their investment is very low. So they're only investing, I'm assuming everybody's reasonably familiar with car sharing, which is essentially rentals of only an hour or two in duration. The second reason that it's interesting to study car sharing is that car sharing fleets actually count towards the ZEV mandates. And not only that, but they actually have a multiplier. So the multiplier used to be a factor of 6, and I believe as of 2012, that's down to 1.75. So we have a policy incentive to understand whether these vehicles are being used effectively, whether that's a good policy. And the last thing is that these people, largely speaking, don't own a car today, but they may well be purchasing a vehicle within a few years. So what matters to people when renting? So anecdotally, we had heard that price, distance, and availability, so essentially the service attributes, were generally the most important criteria, and that environmental impact was ranked much lower. But a previous survey had indicated that nearly 2/3 were interested or extremely interested in electric vehicles, and hybrids and electric vehicles were the top requested cars. That seemed to present a contrast. So we sent out a survey to members of the largest car sharing organization in the U.S., which is Zipcar, and got about 4,000 responses. And a couple of key takeaways here, and I'll keep these brief. The first is more than half the people in the car sharing organization had driven a hybrid vehicle, and that's for a very small number of hybrid vehicles in service. So the ratio is about 400 users exposed to a hybrid per vehicle in service. So I think that's a very powerful statistic. Of course, the numbers are much lower on plug-ins and electric vehicles simply because there are many fewer of those in the fleet, both in the private fleet and in the car sharing fleet. But I think that 400 to 1 ratio is a very powerful number. Second is that we interviewed people about how well they recollected their travel behavior. And people tended to overestimate how far they actually drove in a typical reservation, on the order of about 8%. So at the margin, this is bad news for range-limited vehicles, because people essentially will not take those vehicles when it actually would meet the needs of their travel. So, and the last on this topic is that utility of these vehicles, so people's willingness to use these vehicles was highly dependent on their travel distance. As you would probably expect, utility falls off quite rapidly for electric vehicles. But unfortunately, people's willingness to choose those vehicles also fell off for plug-in hybrids as well. So I think that it indicated a sort of a lack of a need for education of the consumers, a failure to understand what those plug-in hybrid vehicles are actually capable of. So I think those are just a couple of quick conclusions from a larger body of work, but I wanted to share those. Essentially that car sharing is exposing large numbers of users to plug-in vehicles or to hybrids at a minimum. That users are good at estimating time, but they're bad at estimating distance, and this is problematic for plug-in vehicles in car sharing. And then finally, that the plug-in vehicle, both of plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles, seems to fall off with travel distance, but it's never really positive relative to a gasoline vehicle. So we've got a lot of education left to do, and a lot of consumers that are not quite sure they want to take the plunge into a plug-in vehicle, even for a rental.
That was the last?
That was it. So any additional questions or comments? I think we're coming up on the hour here, but I'm happy to take any last questions or comments.
Where can we find a summary of the car sharing report or survey?
I have a draft of that I can email to you. Do you want to just type your email address in the chat box, and I'll write it down here, and I'll send you a copy after we conclude?
Great, thank you.
And for that matter, anybody, if there's anybody here that would like a link to these papers that I've referenced here, I'm happy to send them to you after we conclude. Just send which paper you're interested in and your email address, and I'll make sure that it gets to you.
Can you send us all the slides?
Sure.
We see a question from Charlie Garlow. Are you on the phone? Can you maybe you want to follow up on that question?
Yes, I sent in a chat question there, or comment, I guess.
Yes.
Can the presenter see it?
Can you see the question there?
Yep. Oh, give me a second. That's a long question.
Maybe you want to ask a question for the group, Charlie, so we can.
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and ask it of the group so that the rest.
Sure. I was just saying that you were mentioning that SO2, sulfur dioxide, can be seen sometimes as a reason that gasoline is cleaner than EVs. And my suggestion was, why just pick out that pollutant when if you look at one other pollutant like carbon monoxide, then gasoline cars are almost always going to be worse than electric vehicles there.
Right.
I mean, carbon monoxide killed my grandfather, so I'm concerned about that one. But really more important is CO2, the global warming gas. That's the gas that's most of interest, I think, to most people now.
Right. So, okay, blame my mischaracterization of the work for that misunderstanding. So essentially the studies that I referenced looked at an entire suite of criteria pollutants, so not just SO2. They looked at NOx. I believe they also looked at CO2. I don't have the papers in front of me, but they essentially took the monetized damages from all of those criteria pollutants together. So, and they found that the monetized. I shouldn't be paraphrasing other people's work so extensively here. I think maybe the best thing for me to do would be to send you some references. But in those studies, what they had done is looked at an array of criteria pollutants, not just SO2. It's just that the SO2 was sort of the big driver of damages when it came to coal-fired electricity for EVs.
All right, and that's, of course, getting cleaner all the time as EPA requires cleaner and cleaner coal-fired electricity.
Absolutely, and I think that's the hope of all of us, is that sort of in concert with these PEVs that we see cleaning up of the grid. And I will point you, I guess, to a slide that I was going to include but eventually dropped from this presentation in the interest of time. But if you look at the, again going back to CO2, if you look at the CO2 emissions at a statewide level, and this information is available from the Energy and Information Administration. If you look at the CO2 emissions from generation on a state level, normalized to their overall quantity of generation, what you see is that at a state level, the emissions have been reduced quite a bit, even in the past 4 years. So I looked at 2012, and I think that was the most recent year for which data was available, and I also looked at 2008. And on a per kilowatt hour basis, the carbon emissions seem to have fallen quite a bit in a number of states. So whereas in 2008, California was, I think, number 3 or 4 in terms of the cleanest mix on average, it's fallen a couple of places because the rest of the country has caught up quite a bit. I'm getting outside of my own area of expertise here. I'm sure there are many people on this call with more knowledge than I have in that area. But in short, I agree with you. The grid is getting cleaner every day, and we need to keep pushing in that direction.
Thanks.
Important point indeed. Thank you. So it's almost 11, so I want to thank you, Steve. It was a really good presentation, lots of data, lots of information. I do feel that you are sharing lots of insights, but also open up a number of important questions. I'd like to perhaps follow up with you, maybe one-on-one. And what I do want to say to the audience is that we are hoping that we can post your slides on our website. Is that okay with you?
Fine with me.
So we'll be sending out an email with that announcement. If you don't get it, just look us up, Zero Emission Map at UC Davis. And we probably will have also posting in the website the whole webinar. If you want to see it again, can we see actually the audio and the slides? So you'll be able to watch the whole thing again online for your enjoyment. So with that, I want to thank you again, Steve. Thank you very much for coming all the way from Boston.
Thanks.
Not so nice weather in Davis. It was good to see you. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the time.
Thank you all.